Dr. Miriam Hayes had spent 34 years as a clinical psychiatrist, and she thought she had seen everything. She had treated war veterans drowning in the wreckage of their memories, teenagers who had already decided the world was not worth living in, mothers who had lost children and forgotten how to smile, and executives whose billions bought them nothing but paranoia and sleepless nights. She had watched people unravel, and she had watched them stitch themselves back together, sometimes beautifully, sometimes with crooked seams that would always ache in the rain. But nothing in 3.5 decades of listening to the darkest corners of the human mind, had prepared her for Carol Cole. The hook came on a Tuesday afternoon in November, when the receptionist buzzed her office and said, "Dr. Hayes? Your 2 o'clock is here. She says she doesn't need the full hour. She says she just needs someone to believe her." Miriam almost laughed. In her line of work, every patient came through that door carrying the same desperate cargo, the fear of not being believed. But there was something in the receptionist's voice, a tremor of curiosity that Miriam had learned to trust over the years. She set down her pen, closed the file of the patient before, and said, "Send her in." The woman who walked through the door was unremarkable in the way that truly fascinating people often are. Carol Cole was 62 years old, dressed in a beige cardigan that had seen better decades, grey slacks, and sensible shoes. Her hair was short and practical, the kind of haircut a woman gives herself when she has stopped caring what other people think. Her hands were rough, working hands, gardener's hands, the hands of someone who had spent a lifetime holding on to things that wanted to let go. She did not sit down immediately. Instead, she stood in the middle of Miriam's office, looked around at the bookshelves and the diplomas and the single orchid on the windowsill, and smiled. It was not a nervous smile or a performative one. It was the smile of someone who had already made peace with every possible outcome of this conversation. "Dr. Hayes," she said, and her voice was warm and low, like honey stirred into tea. "Thank you for seeing me. I know you're busy. I won't waste your time. I just need to tell someone my story before I forget the details. The doctors say my memory has about 6 months left, maybe 8 if I'm lucky. And I've realized something terrible and wonderful, and if I don't tell someone who understands the mind, I think I might go crazy before the dementia gets the chance." Miriam felt the familiar shift in her chest, the quiet click of professional detachment giving way to genuine interest. She gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Please, Mrs. Cole. Sit down. Take all the time you need." Carol Cole Saturday. She folded her hands in her lap, and for a long moment, she said nothing. She seemed to be organizing something inside herself, arranging the furniture of her memories before inviting a stranger to walk through the rooms. Then she looked up, and her eyes were the clearest blue Miriam had ever seen, not the pale, faded blue of age, but the sharp, startling blue of a mountain sky after a storm. "I want to tell you about the most fascinating case I've ever seen," Carol said. "And the case is me." For the next 45 minutes, Miriam Hayes forgot she was a doctor. She forgot about the clock on the wall and the notes she was supposed to be taking and the next patient waiting in the lobby. She forgot about her own tiredness, the low-grade exhaustion that had settled into her bones after decades of carrying other people's pain. She simply listened as Carol Cole unfolded. Carol had not always been Carol Cole. Before she was Carol Cole, she was Carol Bennett, a girl born in the flat, empty plains of West Texas in 1962, to parents who had wanted a boy and never quite forgiven her for arriving otherwise. Her father was a roughneck who worked the oil rigs and came home smelling of crude and cheap whiskey. Her mother was a woman who had given up her own dreams of leaving that dusty town and had turned her disappointment into a quiet, constant weapon. Carol learned early that love was conditional, that safety was temporary, that the only person she could truly rely on was herself. She escaped through books. The town library was a small, sad building with peeling paint and a leaking roof, but to Carol, it was a cathedral. She read everything she could get her hands on, novels and biographies and medical textbooks and old encyclopedias. She learned that the world was larger than the space between her father's fists and her mother's silences. She learned that there were words for the things she felt, even if no one around her spoke them. And somewhere in the pages of a dog-eared psychology textbook she found in the discard pile, she learned about the brain. "The brain," Carol said to Miriam, her eyes bright with the same wonder she must have felt as a 12-year-old girl reading that textbook by flashlight under her covers, is the most beautiful thing God ever made. And I don't mean that in a religious way, Dr. Hayes. I mean it in a way that has nothing to do with churches or prayers. I mean that the human brain is a masterpiece of connection and adaptation and survival. It can be broken in 1,000 different ways, and it can find 1,000 different ways to heal. I fell in love with that idea. I fell in love with the possibility that no matter how damaged a person seemed, there was always a pathway back to something like wholeness. She pursued that love with a ferocity that surprised everyone who knew her. She got a scholarship to a state college, then a fellowship to a graduate program in clinical psychology, then a research position at a teaching hospital in Dallas. She specialized in something called profoundly treatment-resistant cases, patients who had been through every therapy, every medication, every intervention that modern medicine could offer, and who had remained stubbornly, heartbreakingly stuck. These were the patients that other doctors gave up on. These were the patients that insurance companies stopped approving. These were the patients that families sometimes abandoned out of sheer exhaustion. Carol took them all. For 30 years, she said, and her voice cracked slightly on the number, I worked with the most broken people I could find. Not because I was a saint. Not because I was trying to save anyone. But because I genuinely believed that every single one of them had a locked door inside their mind, and somewhere, hidden in the mess of their trauma and their grief and their chemical imbalances, there was a key. I just had to find it. And she did find it. Again and again and again. She developed a reputation, first whispered, then spoken aloud, then written up in case studies that made other clinicians shake their heads in disbelief. She took a man who had not spoken a single word in 22 years and taught him to say his own daughter's name again. She took a woman who had been catatonic since the age of 14, trapped inside a body that had become her prison, and over the course of 5 years, she led her back into the world. She took veterans and abuse survivors and refugees who had witnessed horrors that should have shattered anyone, and she sat with them in the wreckage of their minds, and she did not flinch. I never used anything experimental, Carol said. I never prescribed anything off-label or tried any of those controversial therapies you read about in the news. I just listened. I listened harder than anyone had ever listened to them before. I paid attention to the things they weren't saying. I noticed the silences and the small movements and the way their breathing changed when they got close to something important. And I asked questions. Not clinical questions. Not the questions from the diagnostic manual. Real questions. Kind questions. Questions that made them feel like they were worth asking about. She paused, and for the first time, her composure flickered. Her hands, folded in her lap, tightened around each other. Her jaw worked silently, as if she were chewing on something too difficult to swallow. The thing is, she continued, I was so good at helping other people find their locked doors and their hidden keys. But I never thought to look for my own. Here, the story took its first unexpected turn. Carol Cole had been married once, briefly, in her late 20s. His name was Daniel, and he was a high school English teacher with kind eyes and a gentle laugh and a way of reading poetry aloud that made her believe in the possibility of beautiful things. They met at a coffee shop near the hospital, where she went every morning at 6 to prepare herself for the day ahead. He was grading essays and muttering under his breath about misplaced commas, and she overheard him say, If I have to read one more comparison of Gatsby to a golden retriever, I will actually lose my mind. She laughed. He looked up. And that was that. They were married for 4 years. They were happy, not the kind of happy that makes it into movies or greeting cards, but the real kind, the kind that involves burnt toast and arguments about whose turn it was to do the dishes and the quiet comfort of falling asleep next to someone who knew all your worst parts and stayed anyway. Carol thought she had finally found the safety she had been searching for since childhood. She thought she had escaped the legacy of her parents' coldness and her own lonely survival. But here was the thing about Carol Cole, she had never learned to receive. She could give. God, she could give. She could pour herself out for her patients until there was nothing left, and she would wake up the next morning and find some hidden reserve and pour herself out again. She could listen for hours, days, weeks. She could hold space for the worst pain imaginable without flinching or looking away. But when Daniel tried to hold space for her, when he asked about her childhood, when he noticed her flinch at sudden loud noises, when he gently suggested that maybe she had some wounds of her own that needed tending, she shut down. Not dramatically. Not with anger or tears. She shut down the way a flower closes at night, slowly and almost imperceptibly, until there was nothing visible of the person she had been moments before. It wasn't his fault, Carol said to Miriam, and her voice was thick now. The honey turned to something heavier. He tried. He tried so hard. He would come home with books about complex trauma and attachment theory, and he would leave them on my nightstand with little notes in the margins. He would suggest couples counseling, and I would tell him I didn't have time, that my patients needed me, that I couldn't take a single hour away from them. And the terrible truth was that I believed it. I genuinely believed that their pain was more important than mine. That their healing mattered more than my own. That I had somehow used up all my capacity for being helped, and there was nothing left for me. Daniel left after 4 years. He didn't leave dramatically, no slammed doors, no accusations, no dramatic confrontation. He simply packed his things one afternoon while she was at the hospital, and he left a note on the kitchen table that said, "You taught me that every person deserves to be seen. But you won't let me see you. And I can't be married to a ghost anymore. I hope one day you find the key to your own locked door. You've earned it more than anyone I know." Carol never remarried. She told herself it was because she was married to her work, because her patients needed her, because she had chosen a life of service, and that was enough. And for 30 years, it almost was. She built a career that would have been the envy of any clinician. She published papers that changed the way people thought about treatment-resistant depression and dissociative disorders. She trained a generation of younger therapists who spoke of her with the kind of reverence usually reserved for saints or rock stars. She filled her life with purpose and meaning and the daily, intimate work of helping people find their way back from the edge. But she never once sat in the chair on the other side of the room. She never once let someone listen to her the way she listened to everyone else. And then, 6 months ago, the headaches started. The diagnosis came quickly. Early onset Alzheimer's, which was cruel enough, but there was something else, a small, inoperable tumor nestled against her hippocampus, the part of the brain responsible for memory and emotion. The doctors gave her 8 months, maybe a year, and they used words like aggressive and progressive and palliative. They offered her clinical trials and experimental drugs and the kind of false hope that comes in pill bottles. Carol listened politely, asked a few questions that surprised them with their sophistication, and then went home and sat in her empty apartment and waited to forget. But something strange happened in those first few weeks after the diagnosis. Something that Carol, for all her expertise, could not explain. She started remembering. Not the big things, not the facts and dates and textbook knowledge she had accumulated over a lifetime. Those were already starting to slip away, like sand through fingers. No, she started remembering the small things. The forgotten things. The things she had buried so deep that she had convinced herself they no longer existed. She remembered the exact sound of her mother's footsteps on the linoleum floor, the way they would speed up when her mother was angry, the way they would slow down when her mother was drunk. She remembered the weight of her father's hand on the back of her neck, not hitting, just holding, just enough pressure to remind her who was in charge. She remembered the taste of fear, metallic and cold, like licking a battery. She remembered the night she ran away from home at 15, carrying nothing but a backpack and a library book about the human brain, and she remembered the feeling of the train station at 3 in the morning, the way the fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered, the way she sat on a cold metal bench and waited for a train that never came because she didn't have enough money for a ticket. And she remembered Daniel. God, she remembered Daniel. The way he smelled like coffee and old paper. The way he said her name like it was something precious. The way he looked at her the night before he left, and she saw in his eyes that he was already grieving her, that she had already become a ghost to him, and she had done nothing to stop it because she didn't know how. "I spent 30 years helping other people unlock their doors," Carol said, and now the tears were falling freely, silently, tracing lines down her weathered cheeks. "And I spent 60 years standing outside my own, with the key in my hand the whole time, too afraid to turn the lock. Because what if I opened that door and found out that the person inside wasn't worth saving? What if I listened to my own story and realized that I was just as broken as my patients, and all my expertise, all my success, all my giving, what if it was all just a way of avoiding the one person I was most afraid of? She looked at Miriam, and her blue eyes were bright and clear and absolutely unafraid. So here's the fascinating case, Dr. Hayes. Here's the most fascinating case I've ever seen. A woman who dedicated her entire life to healing other people's minds is losing her own mind. And in the process of losing it, she is finally learning how to find herself. Miriam sat in the silence that followed. She was aware, distantly, that her own face was wet. She had not cried in a session in over a decade. She had built her own walls, her own careful distance, her own professional armor. And Carol Cole had just walked through all of it like it wasn't even there. "What do you want from me?" Miriam finally asked, and her voice came out rougher than she intended. "You said you needed someone to believe you. I believe you. But what else? What can I do?" Carol smiled. It was the same smile she had worn when she walked in, the smile of someone who had already made peace with every possible outcome. "I want you to write down what I've told you," she said. "I want you to put it in one of your case files, or publish it somewhere, or tell your students about it. I don't care how. I just want someone to know that the most important work we can ever do is the work of turning toward ourselves. Not instead of helping others. Not as a replacement for service or generosity or kindness. But alongside it. In addition to it. Because you cannot pour from an empty vessel, Dr. Hayes. And I have been empty for so long that I forgot what it felt like to be full." She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and pulled out a small, worn photograph. It showed a younger Carol, maybe 30 years old, standing next to a man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. They were both laughing at something off camera, their heads tilted toward each other, their bodies relaxed in the easy intimacy of people who belong together. "I found this last week," Carol said. "I had forgotten I even had it. I looked at it for a long time, and I tried to remember what it felt like to laugh like that. To let someone see me like that. And I couldn't remember. But here's the miracle, Dr. Hayes. Here's the part that I need you to understand. Even though I couldn't remember the feeling, I could remember that the feeling had existed. And that was enough. That was the key." The door opened, and the person inside was just a scared little girl from West Texas who never learned that she was allowed to take up space in the world. And I sat with her. I listened to her. I asked her kind questions. And for the first time in 62 years, I did for myself what I had done for so many others. She stood up. She tucked the photograph back into her pocket. She smoothed down her cardigan and adjusted her glasses and became, once again, the unremarkable woman in sensible shoes who had walked into the office 45 minutes earlier. "Thank you for believing me," she said. "That's all I needed. Someone to know that it's not too late. Even when your brain is failing and your memories are slipping away and the doctors have given you a countdown. It is never too late to turn the key." She walked to the door. She opened it. And then she paused, her back still to Miriam, and said something that Miriam would carry with her for the rest of her life. "You know, I spent my whole career looking for the most fascinating cases. The most treatment-resistant patients. The most impossible, hopeless, broken people. And I thought the fascination came from the complexity of their suffering. But I was wrong. The fascination, the real fascination, comes from watching someone choose to heal. Not because it's easy. Not because they are guaranteed to succeed. But because the act of choosing, the act of turning toward your own pain with kindness instead of avoidance, is the most beautiful thing a human being can do. And I did it. At the very end, when I had almost nothing left, I did it. And that makes me the most fascinating case I've ever seen." She walked out. The door clicked shut behind her. Miriam Hayes sat in her chair for a long time. She looked at the orchid on the windowsill. She looked at her diplomas on the wall. She looked at the clock, which told her that her next patient had been waiting for 20 minutes. She thought about canceling. She thought about going home early and calling her estranged sister, the one she hadn't spoken to in 5 years over a stupid argument about their mother's estate. She thought about the locked doors in her own mind, the ones she had been walking past for decades, telling herself she was too busy, too important, too needed to open them. She picked up her phone. She cancelled her next 2 appointments. She dialed her sister's number. And somewhere across town, Carol Cole walked out of the medical building and into the November sunlight. She did not know how many days she had left. She did not know which memories would survive the night and which would be gone by morning. But she knew something now that she had not known when she walked in. She knew that she was worth remembering. She knew that the scared little girl from West Texas had finally been seen. And she knew that the most fascinating case she had ever encountered was not a mystery to be solved or a problem to be fixed, but a life to be honored, her own life, in all its broken, beautiful, healing glory. She smiled at the sky. She hailed a cab. And she went home to wait, not for death, but for whatever memories might still come to visit her, each one a small key turning a small lock, each one a quiet miracle of a mind that had finally learned to open itself to itself.